Hi everyone, my name is Anita Ladhani. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and an energy practitioner, and this is part 3 of a 4-part series on raising healthy kids. So today's topic is trauma and children. So let's define trauma first so we understand what that means. The definition of trauma, according to dictionaries, is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience or a physical injury. Trauma for our benefit here is going to be basically something that impacts a child's emotional well-being. And so let's talk about what things can impact a child's emotional well-being. So let's start with the basic. I think how we speak to children definitely impacts their self-esteem. It helps them form certain agreements about who they are. Certain beliefs are formed. And those beliefs end up staying as part of their psyche, their subconscious brain. Verbal abuse, emotional abuse, even though you might not realize you're doing that, actually also is considered trauma. Sharing inappropriate information with kids, exposing them to a little too much, even though you may think they're mature enough. So we'll break these down a little further in a minute. Comparing kids is another way. And then, of course, how you discipline. Physical abuse, physically spanking is also causes trauma. And we'll talk about old school spanking versus, the new generation of kids and spanking and how that impacts them. So the first thing is, when we speak to kids, we may say something, without even realizing we're being hurtful or we're being critical, right? So something like, you're always slow. Why can't you hurry up? Or you always forget stuff. You need to just something as simple as that, where you don't realize that you're being critical, actually ends up labeling kids. So growing up, we've all had, these so-called labels that, were put on us by our family. Well, we probably earned it, but the labels didn't help because the labels stick with us as we grow to be adults. So for me, I was definitely someone who lost things and I broke things, right? So my label was Hatutli and Gumauli, and this is an Indian, thing because I always broke things. I always lost things. You would give me 4 and by the time I would go down the stairs, there would be 2 and I would swear there were 2 because in my, spaciness, I would drop it somewhere and didn't even realize it. And let's talk about that real quick. So, not this spaciness that a lot of parents, notice their kids in, right? This little, not listening the first time, having to repeat yourself, comes from, parents interpret that as a child being disobedient or a child being, difficult, when in fact, research has shown that a child actually not listening is a sign of a brilliant child, because what happens is kids that are gifted, kids that are smart, are constantly in their heads thinking and dreaming, which is all good things, but they're not present because they're just in their heads. And so when a parent will ask the child to, do something or say something, realistically, the child has not even heard the parent. Meantime, we as a parent get upset because we feel slighted, we feel disrespected, and so that's, again, if you have a child that's, really just not noticing, not listening to you, notice if they're actually just ignoring you because they are listening and choosing not to follow your directions, or are they just not hearing you? Okay, so notice the difference because, again, how you respond to a child who doesn't listen to you will be very different if you empathize and you realize that the child is just simply lost in their thoughts versus a child who's just being difficult and being disrespectful. So be careful of the verbal abuse, not just directly to the child, but also if there is verbal abuse going on within the family, if there is emotional abuse, verbal abuse between, husband and wife, and again, I get a lot of, I've gotten a lot of messages over the last few months asking me to talk about this, and so I think this is a nice time to address that when when parents curse at each other, and it may be casual, maybe nothing mean, but it impacts the child. It impacts their ability of who they are and how they feel about themselves. It's even worse when parents have split up and kids are in two different homes, and if they're going back and forth, then that makes it 10 times worse, because what happens is when one parent is criticizing the other parent, what you're really doing is you're criticizing 50% of your child, because your child is a combination of both you and your spouse. And so the child subconsciously looks at that as a rejection of their own self. I must not be good enough if my mom or my dad is calling, the other parent a loser or calling them whatever, and it really impacts them. So again, be mindful of the verbal emotional abuse that, you might not even realize. And if you're doing it, just stop doing it, because it really impacts the kids. The other thing is sharing age appropriate information with children. Now, I see this a lot in the ER. I see this a lot in my private practice. I see this a lot with some of the families that come that I've had the privilege of working with. I recently had a child that was included in a very serious, meeting that was discussing health information about one parent. Needless to say, this was a, 10-year-old child who was allowed to sit in a very sort of, serious health meeting about some procedure one of the parent was going to be having. And the father tells me that, sorry, it was the mother. The mother tells me that she actually was so overwhelmed with the information that she actually left the room and went and cried in the bathroom and then came back. And meantime, this 10-year-old was just left sitting there, to comfort her dad and to listen to the rest of this information. And why would you think that it was okay to include this young child in this adult conversation, right? It was not okay, because that child, is traumatized. That child is now worried about, dad dying, or worried about, life not being normal, all the things that could possibly go wrong, et cetera, et cetera. And I see this a lot, where we don't realize that, one child gets sick, so the siblings sort of, are part of the, family process of going through chemo or radiation or whatever. And sure, that's a different story, but then recognize that even though the child is not directly impacted by the illness, the fact that they're experiencing and seeing the parents and the other sibling go through something traumatic, it impacts them. It impacts them, period. So don't discuss, adult topics with your kids. Don't discuss the lack of money, the financial issues. Don't discuss, be careful if you're on the phone talking to a relative or a friend about, issues that are going on in the house, because, kids listen, kids hear, even though they might be supposedly in front of the TV, you'd be surprised, even if they might be in another room, you'd be surprised, because kids hear everything. They're very nosy, and it impacts them. So, be very careful of the kind of information you expose your child to. Make sure it's age appropriate. If it doesn't, why do they need to be involved? Why do they need to be concerned? Because that ends up being traumatic for them. When we compare kids, so now whether you've got 2 kids or 4 kids or 1 child, whether you're comparing kid to their sibling, now I've been guilty of that. I've compared my youngest to my oldest, and God knows, we paid a price on the impact negatively that it had on my youngest. Or even if we've just compared our kids to other kids, their friends or, the neighbor's kids. Oh, look how, well he's doing, and look how well she's behaving, and look what, internship they're doing, and this is when they're older, or look at, their awards. Comparing kids is not good. Just don't do it. Even if kids in kindergarten, oh, if you don't do this, look how well behaved, your friend is versus you are. It really, again, I know the motivation is positive. I understand that you're trying to, what is the word? Motivate your kid, give them a little bit of, encouragement to hopefully, rise to as good as the friend is. But it really ends up impacting them negatively. And, the other thing that I want to talk about is disciplining kids physically. So verbally disciplining kids, be mindful of how and what you're saying to them. Don't criticize, but what's the word? Discipline, point out the thing that they did wrong. Don't make it about them, right? So, if they made a bad choice, they made a bad choice. It doesn't mean they're a bad person. You made a bad choice in not sharing. Don't say, you're selfish because you don't share. Completely different message, right? Help them learn to distinguish, to separate their actions from their person. Because again, actions can be learned and changed. The person is who they are. So if we are going to shame them about who they are, then we're really destroying the core of who they are. Now that's verbal. Physical abuse. Now, I posted something recently on spanking, and there was a study done on spanking about how it's really impacts negatively kids. And there was a lot of people that were my generation and older who, basically said, well, I got spanked and I turned out fine. And then I had this discussion with some colleagues at work. And what I realized and what we realized in our discussion was that, yeah, I was spanked as a child, and it didn't impact me negatively. My brother was spanked as a child. We know our parents loved us. We know we deserved the spanking, but it was different when it's this generation. So when my kids were younger and I spanked my children, because again, that's what I was raised with. So that was what I did, because you always do what you know. And when you know better, you do better, Maya Angelou, right? So I remember, the first couple of times I would spank my child, and then it was like we were just in a, moment, and I went to go reach over and hug my son, and he flinched. And that was a wake-up call for me, because I realized that he actually thought I was going to spank him, and he was so traumatized by that it broke my heart. Not to mention, I realized that I was losing control when I spanked, because I was doing it when I was angry. I wasn't spanking, the way our parents spanked, or in the way, you were able to spank before. I was just more aggressive and more assertive and more stronger in my spanking physically. To me, I think it was borderline abuse going back, and thank God I recognized it, that it wasn't helping. There came a day very early on where my child said, well, I don't care if you hit me. It doesn't hurt anyways. And that just broke my heart, because the point was not to hurt him. The point was to help him realize that he was being punished and he needed to make better choice. And instead of that message coming through, he was completely missing the message. And so I very quickly had to stop, apologize, have a discussion, and teach myself how to use positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement in terms of rewards and losing privileges. And it worked, that worked. But of course, that kind of parenting takes a lot of effort. It was draining. It was a lot of work, but it was the right thing to do, having charts and keeping tracks of that. And because again, reinforcing positive behavior, taking away things that they liked, letting them earn the things they liked. It's work. Parenting is work, and that's the way to do it. Now, what happens is, I think our generation and older, we were just made differently. But I mean, we were not even that smart. I mean, think about it. When we were younger, we didn't think about a lot of these things that, these kids think about. I think every generation that's born has been wiser and wiser and wiser. There's been indigo kids. Look it up if you're not sure what that is. There's been generation of star kids. These are really old souls who have come in to sort of, change the energy frequency of the world. Even if you don't believe in any of that, just look at your child and look at the stuff that comes out of your child's mouth at their age versus what we used to think and comprehend and express when we were their age. So it impacts them differently than it did us. So for that simple reason, the research done with the current, last 15, 20 years, if not, 25, 30 years of, kids who are now adults, it has impacted them negatively because, again, those kids are different. They're a different generation of kids being raised in a different cultural environment. And for that reason, disciplining physically is not okay. It's something that, just because you did something in the past and we all survived doesn't mean that it's okay to continue doing that. So, I can sit here and give you examples of organic foods and, water, and just when you know better, you do better. So we used to eat all kinds of crap before, and, some of us got sick and, chronic, diseases, and some of us did fine. But now that we know better, we make better choices. But if you don't know better, then you just don't. So doesn't mean that just because it didn't impact us, doesn't mean that it didn't have a negative effect on us. So similarly, when you know better, you do better. So parents, I urge you, and again, the intention of anything that I present to you is simply to help you to think about what you're doing. Just sit back and evaluate your behavior. Sit back and evaluate your life. There's no judgment on my part at all because trust me, I've made all the mistakes. That's why I've learned and I've paid, and I've caused trauma for the kids, and I've spent money in sending them to therapy, and whatnot. And again, remember, this is something that I do professionally as well. So I see the impact of this stuff on a day-to-day basis in the kids that I have the privilege of working with. I hope this has been helpful. This was part 3, and I will hopefully do part 4. Not sure what the topic's going to be, but I'm sure it will come in time. And love and light, and God bless. Take care. Bye-bye.